Robots are a big deal and they're only getting bigger, and every company that shows them off is very careful to protect their IP because they know what happens when you show off your latest greatest. Some of those ideas get stolen, and of course they do, because that's what those companies are doing too. Everybody's copying everybody else because it's a race, and what are you going to do about it? Well, you're going to do what I do, which is bring on an expert who actually knows what he's talking about. I'm Brian. Welcome to Futuraza. Got Dr. Scott Walter with me here, and we are talking about protecting your secrets. Tesla learned the hard way. So what happened with Tesla's bot demos that led others to be cautious?
Well, a lot of people copied them. I mean, virtually the same bots suddenly start showing up, clones of them. And so you've got to be a bit careful what you show in your demos, because other people will be able to intuit quite a bit from it. You know, I'm kind of famous at looking at what's going on and guessing what's going on. And if I can do it, people with a lot of expertise can clearly do it as well, figure out how to reverse engineer it and come up with the ideas. Now, sometimes you might be intentionally throwing everyone off. You might show something with your design that you actually do not intend to use, and they go ahead and copy it. And if they don't know what they're doing, they're going to get themselves in trouble. You never want to copy someone's design. You want to get inspiration from it. You want to see what are the good and the bad of it. And then from that, figure out, okay, what's the next step that I can do to improve upon it? Because if you're copying it straight out, it means you have no idea what you're doing. And then if they're doing something else, you don't know how to shift course because you've already committed yourself to the wrong design.
What I did in high school biology, there was a kid who would sit next to me and always copy my paper. And it drove me a little crazy. So the question was, and I remember it to this day, this was in 11th grade, I think. What is the lowest third of the insect called? And I thought this will be hilarious. And I wrote duodenum. And he copied it, and then I walked up to turn my paper in, and I crossed out and, of course, wrote thorax. And when the teacher got to the other kid's paper and saw duodenum and looked up and saw where he was sitting, he was like, oh, we have to have a conversation. Just kind of funny. I thought that'd be funny. It's the last third of something. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So now we're catching up to speed. Now we've got that story out of the way. I've seen a couple posts from you recently that suggest that people are learning lessons. PNDbotics was one frame too late blurring out their new hand. They missed it by a frame. They blurred it out almost. Tell me what we're looking at here.
Well, this is kind of funny because a few days before, when 1X came out with a pretty long documentary, and they're showing their Neobot going around, I was like, no, wait, there's all this pixelation going on around wrist. I didn't realize there was like wrist porn or something like that, that there's some naughty bits or bites there or something like that you're not supposed to see. And I realized because they're trying to cover up their IP, because the wrist designs can be, and in that case, you see a little bit, but they have like a more full-blown documentary that's like 18 minutes that you can go through, where they definitely wanted to make sure, do not show anyone exactly what's going on a wrist. We don't want to have an idea. And now P&D is interesting because they're one of those Chinese companies that just sort of showed up out of nowhere about a year ago. And they're coming up with a lot of original work. So they clearly are studying other people and doing, like, or they say it's okay to get inspiration, but then kind of coming up with their own designs and everything else. And they have a pretty good full body, with the exception of the hands. So they can walk without falling over, go up ramps and do all this other stuff. It's really pretty interesting, but they didn't really have any hands on there. So this is the first time we saw a video yesterday where they had hands. And if you watch the video, the next frame after this, it's all blurred out. Because if you look on what is the left hand there, you can see how blurry it is. Mm-hmm. They missed by one. So I get a little bit of an idea of what's going on there. So I can see it looks like they've got 5 fingers and a thumb. You can sort of see the thumb down there a little bit. It's hard to tell how many knuckles. They have at least 2 knuckles. Maybe they have 3. I have a feeling they might be going to the 3 knuckles, like Tesla is moving in that direction. Everyone has 2 knuckles at first. I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of companies decided we're just going to go 2 knuckles at first because we think that's easier to make fingers that way. And now they're realizing maybe you really need the 3. I would not be surprised if they have 3 in there, just because these guys seem like they're doing their homework really quite well in a lot of the things. The wrist is not too bad. It's really hard for me to see, but I think they're getting the right style of wrist. It doesn't seem to be too bulky. And it seems to have what we call a yaw pitch roll wrist. There's a lot of other companies out there, and their wrists are what we call a roll-pitch-roll wrist, which is exactly the kind of wrist that an industrial robot has, and it's exactly the kind of wrist you do not want to have in your humanoid bot. All right.
Why?
Because it has something called a singularity. Because when you have a roll, pitch, and a roll, when your pitch axis is lined up, your roll axis here and your roll axis here line up, and you get what's called a singularity. Now, some of them have done that in the shoulder and down and the pelvis. You've seen that with Boston Dynamics and I think Unitree, where they'll show the arms going out there and spinning around, and they're all proud about that. And I'm like, I wouldn't be proud of that. It's showing that my robot arm has a singularity. It's not a good thing to have from a programmatic standpoint when you're trying to move through a certain space that your axes are suddenly having to move around really quickly. So, and you definitely don't want to have it in your wrist, because that's like right the sweet spot. That's right where you want to be operating, right in the middle. You don't want to have that. So you want to have these different things. The term that a lot of people use is, you've probably heard before, gimbal lock. The idea that, if you get an aircraft or something like that in the wrong orientation, that suddenly the gyros will lock up and you lose the position that you're in. Apollo 13, there's a scene in there where they talk about they have to watch out for the gimbal lock. Otherwise, they're going to have to get star orientations again to figure out exactly where to reset everything. So it's something you want to avoid. And they're avoiding that with their wrist design. The Tesla wrist is definitely, has a proper kind of wrist. And also the Neo wrist is doing that. I think, the figure wrist seems to be correct, but I've seen a lot of them coming out doing it the wrong way. So they seem to be doing that right. The only thing about it is, I think because they're trying to get so much motion in, their wrist is really difficult. Your wrist should be very thin. It has to move in 3 degrees of freedom. You got to add all these actuators and all this other stuff in there. So a lot of them have what I refer to as a sprained wrist, a really sprained wrist where it's like really swollen and big, and a sprained wrist where they're wearing a diving watch at the same time. Okay. So there's just like a lot of material there you don't want to have. You want to have your wrist very thin. So when you go into the dishwasher to pull something out, your wrist isn't bumping into stuff or doing any kind of access. So it's a bit tricky to do that. And I think as a result, if you look at that picture, you'll say, well, the distance from the shoulder to the elbow looks normal, but then the distance from the elbow out to where's the center of where the wrist is seems to be way out there. So this thing
Orangutan.
Exactly. This thing looks like a real knuckle dragger, if you ask me.
Well, it also is a bit headless.
It doesn't have a head on it. However, they are showing some images that they do have some with the head. And the head is basically for the eyes. So they do have some eyes. The video it came from, they have a little bit more in there. So if you just look up PNDbotics, you'll be able to see it. And if you're going to pick like a dark horse coming out of China, because there's a couple others that are more well known, like Unitree and Fourier, that this is the one that of all the ones that are just kind of starting up, that I would say I think they're going to do well, because it just seems like they've done their homework. Now, I don't know what their AI solution is going to be like, but they're pretty good at walking. They've demonstrated the ability of walking there and everything else. So, and they have maybe a half dozen or dozen bots at this point, based on some of the images that are out there. And it might be their first generation hand. It's not a bad attempt for the first time for a company that's maybe 2 years old at most.
Now, does Bernt know who you are?
Yes, Bernt Bornich. Yeah. Yes, because he said he actually said he's a bit afraid of me. Yes.
Yeah, because he knows that you know your stuff, and he's like, "Oh no, Scott saw something I didn't want him to see." It's fun.
Now the real secret of what they have is going to be behind the wrist, because they have a very good looking hand there. So they had an earlier version of a bot called Eve. And as a matter of fact, the bot that we just saw from PNDbotics is called Adam. Think about that for a second. This is Neo.
Don't have to.
Yep. And the original Eve bot actually had an off-the-shelf standard industrial robot gripper from Robotique. It was just one of those little parallel grippers that goes like this. So they've gone from what was like paddle hands to suddenly the best hand out there right now. Okay. And that's actually saying a lot, because there are some pretty good hands that the other bot manufacturers have. I know Gordy Rose from Sanctuary is going to be jumping up and down when he sees this right now, because he thinks they have the best hand. And I'd say they're right up there. But the thing is, his hand is hydraulically controlled. This one is not. This one is using actuators. And it's definitely better than the TeslaBot hand, because the TeslaBot hand current one is only 11 DOF. This one is a 20 DOF one. So you can say, aha, it's the best for now, but Tesla's coming out with a 22 DOF hand. It's like, but the way they count their DOFs is a little bit different. This one is not counting the wrist. I believe that Tesla is going to be counting the wrist in there. So if you actually count the wrist in it, it's actually 23 DOF. So if you want to get an idea what the Tesla hand is going to look like, look at the 1X video and you'll get a pretty good idea. Because what they've done is everything right. They've got 3 knuckles that are out there. They've got fingers that can move like this. I don't know if the actuators are such that they can do that, but they can do this movement as well as the clenching. They have an extra, what appears to be an extra knuckle in the thumb, which is why they go from 23 to 22. And it looks like you only need 2 on your thumb because you only can see 2. The third one you can't see because it's down here. So that means they have a lot of range of motion there in their thumb, and their fingers are all different lengths. Something the other bot companies have decided not to do just because it seems like it'd be easier for manufacturing. So their hand looks very natural and very good. And it also looks really thin. You know, if you look at the profiles, like there's nothing there. If you look at some of the other bots, the palm is really rigid and really big. So this hand is a very, very good hand for a company that didn't have a hand to suddenly have this. It's one of the top ones. But the big question, of course, how do they actuate this thing? And it's like they get some stuff down here in the forearm that's pulling on tendons. Tesla's going to be doing the same thing. They're also going to be pulling on tendons. Figure is pulling on tendons too. Almost all of them, they're using some sort of tendon drive. The question is whether the actuators are built into here or whether they're down there. Now, if your tendons are down here or your actuators are down here, your tendons have to go through where?
Absolutely.
They have to go through your wrist.
Yeah.
Which means you need to have a carpal tunnel for these things to be able to come through, to be able to get up there and do all the actions that you want it to have. The question is, like, that forearm, if you look at that, that is not a very big forearm. And they have a minimum of at least 7 actuators for those fingers, because they're able to move all of these fingers down like this. So you got 5 fingers that can clench. The thumb already needs 2 degrees of freedom. So that's your 6th one. And then you would need another actuator to be able to do that if they're not independent. If they are dependent, you would need to have 10. How do you think they're fitting either 7 to 10 actuators in there? What do they look like?
Is it a milled piece with just holes through it? Does it look like a bunch of drinking straws glued together?
Well, what's the motor look
for
like?
sure.
See, the one way you're thinking is like, well, I've got a tendon, and one way to make the tendon go forwards and backwards is I can go ahead and put it on some sort of reel, like a fishing line, like, which means you got to have a bunch of motors that are here like that. But wait a minute, the tendons are pulling this way. So how do you get all the wiring down there to be able to pull these things in and out? So it means, it sounds like you might want to have some sort of linear actuators where you're just kind of pulling in your puppet string and releasing and pulling and, doing that. And of course they have springs in the knuckles to allow them to pop open. Otherwise you need to have 2 tendons to be able to open and close. So the opening is done with a spring, the clenching is done pulling on that, and they've got some compact linear actuators in there that might be a unique design.
But we'll get there.
Yeah,
we'll get there. You start with a giant clock, and eventually you have a wristwatch, and then a pocket watch that's even small.
I mean, it's smaller. It's even smaller.
Very small.
Yeah. Now, if we just get back to the wrist, the wrist for a second, you get like a joint that moves this way, and another joint, that does this and that. And the way a lot of them have done is said, I've got a joint here that moves, and I need something that makes that joint move. I'll make a motor there, because the motor will be both my joint and the thing that makes the joint move. And then you got to build another motor the other way. And sometimes it's hard to do that, which is why you have like weird offsets with the motors coming back. But the main thing is motors take up a lot of space and everything else. Tesla solved that problem by putting a simple joint there, which is called like a Cardan joint. And they have these push-pull bars back here so that the muscles for it is kind of away from the wrist rather than at the wrist. Because if you put the muscles at the wrist, that's a problem. That's a really big problem for you, right? So if you can put it back here to drive it, that means your wrist can be nice and thin and everything works well. But in the case of Tesla, right now, they have these 2 big linear actuators built in the forearm to make the wrist move around, which is great. Well, now they want to move all the actuators that are in their hand, and they want to move them back here to get the fingers to move. Not a whole lot of space left over there, because you get these things in here, and now you're trying to take those actuators and move them back there. How are you going to get them to move? Well, I know how 1X
And you
has solved
still
the
need
problem.
strength. Yeah.
You know how 1X has solved the problem? They're
No, I don't.
they're using these special tendon drives, and if you look at their patent, you will see what looks like, oh, they've got a motor at the wrist, right here at the elbow. And you would think that that motor at the elbow is actually meant to make the elbow rotate. No, 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 no. That motor there actually has tendons on it that goes and controls the wrists. And it's
Hmm.
actually split, that they've got two motors that are there that are on one side of another. And then they have a weird drum mechanism here, and they actually use what they call a differential. And they have tendons that go back here and motors way up here in the shoulder that make the elbow move. Okay.
Oh,
So that
sure.
means they compacted everything right there, which means they get all this space right here to put whatever the heck they want in there for the hand. That's brilliant, because
Wow.
everyone else is either get their motors out here, and which means if you take the motors there, it's like taking an ankle weight or a big weight and putting it in the end of your hand, which we know is like, oh, that makes it hard for me to move my arm around. If I could take that mass and move it
Right.
further back, it makes everything lighter and easier to move. So I think we're seeing an insight that Tesla may be thinking a similar kind of thing of like, well, do we still have those two linear actuators that we've seen there, or how are we going to compactify that whole thing, because we've got to have the wrist axis in there as well as this rotation here. And the Neo robot from 1X has figured it out brilliantly on how to get both this motion and that motion at the same joint with these guys up here. So it's an incredible design that's different than what everyone else is doing. And again, I think there may be some hints of what we can see from the Gen 3 bot.
So let's rewind 5 years. How
Mhm.
many serious companies were there looking at developing a humanoid bot with the potential for commercialization?
Maybe a handful. Okay,
Yeah.
you still had Honda in the business with Asimov, but they gave up in 2017. Boston Dynamics had already been around for like 1 or 2 decades. Um, and then you had in 2015, you had 1X. Around, I think,
Mm-hmm.
2015, 2016, you had Aptronic out of Houston with
Mm-hmm.
Apollo. And you also had 1X was incorporated in 2015. So, and then it wasn't until what, 2021 that Tesla announced
Right.
the Tesla button. And then after that, all sorts of other people start jumping in there. So you're literally talking about a handful that were serious. There were some research organizations and some universities looking at
Sure.
bipedalism and stuff like that. Oh,
Sure.
and sorry, I should go back. Agility also. So agility would
Sure.
also be the early teens, and Sanctuary. Okay, so
Okay.
Sanctuary was, I think,
So
they were like 20, 18,
six-ish,
18 like that. So yeah. So
half dozen
half dozen,
ish.
about a half
And
dozen.
now
Yeah.
And now today, how many serious companies are there just that you know of looking at commercializing humanoid bots?
Okay, so if you go down there, the list might get really big. You might get close to like 100 companies that are like all announcing something, but I think it's a lot smaller than that. It's probably a couple of dozen. So CERN's list, I think the last time you get it was getting close to 30. So a lot of them are coming out of China. We're finally hearing like maybe one out of Japan, one out of Korea, because I wonder, it's like, where are they? They haven't been doing it. And occasionally you hear a couple out of Europe that are being announced that they're working on something like that. More garage band startups in Silicon Valley, they're thinking of it. And also I know a company out of Israel. So, easily 2 dozen or so that you could say are potentially serious players, and a bunch of others that are maybe trying to figure their way out.
So 4 to 6 times growth in just a handful of years,
Mm-hmm.
and another 4x on top of that in terms of companies that really say they're working on it and maybe are.
Yes,
This is an exciting time. This
it
is an
is.
exciting time. In your life, what do you think the most robots you will personally have?
Oh, in my life. Oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
interesting. So it's just like if you asked me that question 20 years ago, how many phones do you think you would have, or something like that? And I would say,
right.
oh, just the one that's sitting on over there on my desk. That's the only phone I need, right? But now the idea of being able to carry them around, and every family member having one, and one for work and one for private is something else. I would certainly think I'm expecting to have at least one. But the question is like, well, wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute. You're talking about a humanoid, but what about your lawnmower?
No,
Your
no,
lawnmower might be a
right.
robot, and your vacuum cleaner. Oh, well, I guess I have one right now because I do have a Roomba. it's not, it
Right?
doesn't work quite as well as I'd like it to, but I think in 5 years it might work a lot better, like the way I want it to be. Or maybe I
Yeah.
don't, because my humanoid bot will just take my Dyson and then, do everything. So I don't need that. So that's what we don't know, is
Yeah.
just how much automation we're going to have. But we're going to have a lot more. Oh, I have one in my garage. I forgot to tell you about that.
Oh, that's right. The one with four wheels. What
The one
color
with
is
four
it?
wheels, exactly. Mine is blue. Yeah, mine's blue.
Blue. Yeah, yeah.
Blue, yeah.
Well, a lot of good robots are. I tell you, man, I've test driven a whole lot of EVs, and some of them are really good drivers. But I mean, for me to drive, I don't think I could go back to a car that doesn't have a supercharger network and that doesn't have autonomy. It's getting real good, real quick. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you to Scott Walter, the 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 man who inspires fear in so many roboticists who are trying to keep secrets, because he's very good at picking apart information from very limited data. Guys, what did we miss? What did we misunderstand? How many robots do you own and will you own is my question. Leave it in the comments below, and stay tuned, stay juicy, and I cannot wait to hear from you clever robots on the flippity flop.
The humanoid bots.